Good afternoon. As I explained last time, I'll make some time at around 4:15 for questions from the audience. I didn't do that last time, but essentially because I was carried away by what I was trying to say. As I said also, I will always start my presentation with a recap, with a little summary of what was said last time. And I'd like to thank Tom for having worked on the salmon fatting. Somebody on my blog watched the video of last week and said, "You never said what ethics is about." But my feeling was that I had talked a lot about ethics. I didn't try to give a proper definition, but the way I presented things, in particular going back to ancient China and the difference between Confucianism and Taoism, I believe that I explained that what I was trying to do was to avoid to get into the, how would I say, the intricacies, the difficulties of political philosophy by just giving a very essentially pragmatic definition of what ethics would be as being a set of principles, written or not written, implicit or explicit, that makes it possible for a certain type of society to reach a particular size. A size in terms of the people who can work together, who can live together, the density of population that can be achieved within a particular surrounding. And that requires a number of rules which are enforced with police and jails if people don't comply with that, but also with implicit principles, what Durkheim called the internalized social, the kind of moral prescriptions which have become so ingrained in ourselves that we don't even think about them. They come to us naturally. These are the things we do, as we say, without even saying. And that's what I was trying to do, not give a proper definition, but explain that in different surroundings, people are required to operate in a certain way. And I drew the attention to the fact that a number of philosophers, or to add some other type of thinkers like Sigmund Freud, have wondered how much liberty, how much freedom do we have to sacrifice in order to acquire in return a particular type of, a particular level of security in order to live in peaceful surroundings. The way you, as I said, the way you look at that issue is very different according to what starting point you're taking. If you regarded man as a species which is essentially made out of individuals that can operate individually, and that at some point in history they got together and through what Rousseau called a social pact or a social contract decided that they would live within a society. That's a particular type of approach. Then you define the elementary brick of our society as being a kind of Robinson Crusoe who decides through some arrangement to work, to operate together with other human beings he would encounter, like in the story when Robinson Crusoe discovers that savage that he calls Friday. If you take the opposite view, which is that our very nature is being social, like would, for instance, that was the view of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher in his time, then you have a very different approach to the issue of ethics. And I oppose the two type of approaches as being a top-down or a bottom-up. Top-down meaning that we regard society or group organization as being the given from which we work, and individuals are bricks within a larger organization, or the bottom-up, looking at individuals and regarding them as being likely or having the possibility of getting together and organizing themselves as a larger group. I underline that social anthropology, the field in which I was raised, or sociology, another field that I was educated in, have their view is that we are both. We are both individuals that have freedom to operate in our societies in a particular way, and we are also, I would say, by birth and by definition, part of a larger group. So therefore, that you have, if you want to give explanations, either as societies as being an aggregation of individuals, or if you regard individuals as being likely to aggregate in order to make a larger group, you have to develop both approaches. And that they must be consistent. You can't have any contradiction in your two types of explanations. They have at the same time to be able to account for the fact that individuals make groups and that groups are made out of individuals. And I use as an image for that the title of a the title of a book by a British anthropologist called Rodney Needham, who called his book Structure and Sentiment. Sentiment being very much the bottom-up approach of individuals who feel things and will resist institutions or will want to create institutions, and structure being the bottom-down approach where you start from the organization as a whole and look at the individuals as being elements within it. I went on to start talking a bit about different aspects of the very beginning of economics, and the fact that in the first part that I would define as being, let's say, the 18th century up to the 1870s, it was very much a sociological approach. It was typical of the way that philosophers and the first economists would look at the economy. In that first part, it was called political economy. The main thinkers of which are Adam Smith in the 18th century, wrote a major book called The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. After him, you have David Ricardo, and the last major thinker within that particular approach was Karl Marx. From the 1870s, developed a very different approach, which is not based at all in a bottom-down approach, which is a top-down approach. But from a bottom-up approach, you develop what is called the science of economics, and that has a very different approach. It is essentially, and by a decision, it is a bottom-up approach. The method which is used is called methodological individualism, and it assumes that there's no bottom-down effect at all. There's no emergence within that view of anything specific. There are no structures which operate according to different mechanisms than what you could describe simply as an aggregation of individual behavior. And I gave some counterexample of that, like a marching regiment which has the possibility of destroying a bridge by walking in step. The question we have to ask ourselves, and that's probably the way, one way of phrasing that, the purpose of these lectures of the stewardship of finance, is asking ourselves, how does finance now fit within this framework? If we regard institutions as defining the way our societies are working, the question we have to ask ourselves is, and that as I said, that if ethics is a kind of framework of rules that allows a society to have a particular size, a particular density of population, we have to ask ourselves, is the working of finance right now compatible with the level of development in terms of structures that we have achieved? What is indicating that there might be an issue there is that if ethics is the very framework within which a society must operate in order to be workable, we have to admit as a principle, and I gave the example of medicine, that we can't ask ourselves, is medicine ethical or is politics ethical, and so on. We can admit that some individuals will try to infringe the principles, that they will commit fraud, but we can't imagine that one of the organs from which our societies are made would essentially discard the whole idea of ethics and decide that it doesn't apply to itself. This is, I would say, that the fact that finance does that, has done that over the past 1.5 centuries, might be a symptom of an issue as such. We'll go deeper into that, in particular to India today. The switch from political economy, being a type of sociological approach to economic facts, to the new science of economics, is very much a turning point in terms of what are the issues we have now. It is very much at that time that appears that view that finance is somewhat autonomous and that the principles which should be which apply totally generally to all societies, that they would be an exception regarding to that. I drew the attention to the fact that it is not the fact that Karl Marx was a revolutionary who was studying economics essentially to, in order to have a method for explaining to people why the capitalist system within which he was living had weaknesses, and that these weaknesses would bring its downfall. It's not him who produced the scare that led to a change in approach. It was very much the person he inspired himself, which was David Ricardo. Was not in any way a revolutionary himself. He was a banker and a speculator, a very successful person in finance. But he had determined this principle, which, as I said last time, can be discussed because it's far from obvious that all value is produced by work, a principle that, that Karl Marx took himself. I underline that there are different approaches showing that every element which is brought together in order for producing something might be a catalyst of the whole process, and that therefore there might be other elements that produce value than work. But the fact is that there was a turning point. This was not appreciated. There was a sentiment. It's not a new thing. It's not a recent thing that if you speak in American universities, and that's happened to me, and I would maybe on the same day speak to social anthropologists in the morning and to economists in the afternoon, and that happened to me at Yale University in Connecticut in the United States. And when I visited the social anthropology department, there were pans on the floor because there was rain dripping from the roof because there were holes in the roof. And when I got to the economy faculty, there were huge marble pillars. And that was because the issue is a bit the one we have today, which is what will sponsors rather encourage as an activity within a private university or as in universities as they are now. And they have different views about what deserves to be supported as research. The turning point. The turning point was, therefore, and that's where I start my new lecture now, Marx said capitalism is a type of economic system which has major weaknesses, and these weaknesses are such that it makes that economic system mortal, and it will disappear in due time. I make a little remark. What Marx said was the reason why the capitalist system would disappear is not something which is observed right now. he saw the major source for the disappearance of the system, a dwindling margin of profit in human activities. And this is definitely not the case right now, which leads some Marxist economists to say that the system currently is not in major difficulties because the cause of the disappearance of capitalism is definitely not observed right now. The reaction, and as I said, it was not a deliberate effort that people would get together in a kind of conspiracy and say, we're going to counter Karl Marx, but different things appeared in different places, in England in particular, in France, in Germany, in Austria, in Switzerland, research that was showing that there was no need to approach things the way that had been done. And the symbol of that switch was moving from the elementary unit in the in an economic system being either a class, a group of people having a similar function in the economy, moving to the individual. The individual would be being in different functions or roles in society, but these would be defined essentially by one thing, which would be the social division of labor. And the explanation that would be given by the people who defend that new type of economy of why there would be an earlier description of societies in terms of groups would be that there was an illusion, and that illusion was essentially produced by the resentment of people who did not understand how societies work in terms of the division of labor. These people would believe that there are groups and that these groups are in a struggle, but that would be an illusion. The justification for saying that that our system, that the capitalist system, hasn't got major weaknesses, and that is therefore not mortal, would be to say, in fact, it is immortal, and it has maybe some very slight superficial weaknesses, but nothing really serious to be taken into account. And the reason why it isn't a system which is nearly perfect and immortal is because it corresponds to the very, very nature of man, because it is the only system which is rational. Human beings are rational, and therefore it is the best system for them. The difficulty, and that's what I announced at the end of the previous lecture, is that in order to say that, a new definition of rationality has to be produced. And that definition of rationality is not entirely compatible or consistent with what had been said before about what is rational behavior. So what was regarded as rational behavior before that time? Well, the person who had really set up, I would say, the framework within which to analyze these things was Aristotle. Aristotle has developed a view of what we call logic now. He was making distinctions. He didn't call it logic. The term logic came later on. I think it's the 4th or 5th century AD. He was making distinctions between what he called analytics and dialectics and rhetoric and so on. But he defined the principles of rationality as being the following. It is a linguistic process. It got nothing much to do with instinctive behavior or making economic choices. What is rational is a capacity to make a reasoning. And the reasoning is done to be valid. It needs to be done on the form of the syllogism. You take one proposition and you take a second proposition, and the condition in order to make a reasoning is that there should be an element which is common to these two sentences. And then you can make a new statement which will tell you something new that you didn't know by eliminating the middle term and reuniting the two terms which appear only once. I give you an example. Whales are mammals. Mammals feed their children with milk. Therefore, if you didn't know that, well, whales feed their children with milk. It's a deduction. It is a reasoning. You may not have known that from before. You knew that whales were mammals. You knew that mammals have milk that they give to nourish their children, but you find something new, which is a consequence. And what did Aristotle do? He showed the principles through which you could make correct syllogism. If you were introducing some negative element in one sentence, if you were saying that some things are a particular type, but all things are another type, if you were actually looking at things in bulk or specific parts of it, you could produce conclusions which would be valid or not. And he made the first classification of that, and there was no error. I mean, there was no, as Hegel said then in India in the 19th century, he said Aristotle created logic and there was nothing to add to it for centuries. People started discussing about other things later on as part of logic. What can you say about the future, for instance? Can you say anything with certainty about the future? Yes, you can say some things with certainty about the future. If something is impossible, you can say that it will never happen. If it's necessary, you can say that it will always happen, and so on. So some additional reflections were added to rationality in that time. Why do we call it reason and rationality? Because the ratio is actually the relationship between two of the elements in the proportion. If you represent a syllogism, you can represent as a proportion with one element being common to both sentences. And the ratio, the reason, is the middle term that we'll actually remove. The reason you can make the conclusion is because you've removed that element which was in the middle, like mammal in the short example I gave. Why do whales give milk to their children? The reason is the fact that they are mammals. And you see, it goes without saying. We understand that. We understand that it works in that way. Of course, ratio is a reason. Comes from a Latin word. You know what the word is in Greece. When Aristotle was talking about that, the word for reason there was logos. And we know about analogy. When we say analogy, we have that term logos in there. An analogy is not a syllogism. An analogy, you have four terms. There's no middle term. There's no term you can eliminate. But with an analogy, you can make an interesting comparison between two different things. When we turn then to the 1870s, and the new economists say that men are rational, they don't mean at all that we can make reasoning by using syllogism. They use the word in a totally different way. And I gave you the definition briefly before we left last time. Man is rational, homo economicus, the man who's the subject of the new economic science. He's a rational in one particular way, which is that faced to scarce resources, and the economy regards that we always face with scarce resources. The man who is rational will make choices which are based on preferences, and these preferences are defined by the relative utility of the different possible choices that can be made. So we understand what it means, and we understand that you can make irrational choices if you wish. You can decide that if you have preferences and that faced with the possibility of allocating money to these preferences, if you don't do in the order of these preferences, if you start spending your money on the thing that you least like, then you will not be rational in that sense. You will make the wrong decision. You will obviously be not consistent in the ranking you've made of these utilities towards yourself. If we think of the times when these things were said, the late 19th century, a simple sociological observation is that very few people in these societies at the time had a heap of money that could be used for different types of utilities and so on. Most people had only one possible use for the money they had. It was in order to feed themselves, to raise the children, to be able to go to the factory the following day. And therefore, it's difficult to avoid the view that that rational man, that economical, homo economicus, is actually the bourgeois of the time, the person who has enough money that he can actually, or she, make decisions about how to allocate it between different people. To some extent, we can say the problem of the groups and the classes had been eliminated by everybody being made bourgeois with a heap of money within the approach. The patron saint, I would say, of the economists, and you will see a symbol of that in the Adam Smith Society. The Adam Smith Society in the United States is a society to which people in finance, economic professor belong, and they regard that Adam Smith as being the founder of a particular view, which is that we can now locate quite easily within that, how would I say, the setup that I've described so far. The setup is what the central view there is very much one of a bottom-up approach, is very much in the line of man not being a social being by definition, but a being, an animal, which decides in some circumstances to get together with others using his or her freedom in order to do so. The view which is developed is that a very much Robinson Crusoe individual, economicus, makes decisions to unite or not with other people according to circumstances. The major drive of his behavior is the self-interest, and that self-interest will be enough to make the system operate. That view, as I said, is assigned to Adam Smith. It is a major misunderstanding. It's not a view that Adam Smith was at all attached. It is part of this book of Thomas Sedlacek, who comes he will be talking to us in November. He spends a major part of his book explaining that as a terrible misunderstanding of having assigned to Adam Smith views which were not his. The views which are assigned currently to Adam Smith. And Thomas Sedlacek is not the only one. There's a British writer called Emma Rothschild, who had written on these issues also. She had really underlined the fact that the current representation of what Adam Smith was saying and the person he was has been totally misrepresented currently. And it's a pity, therefore, that in many economics faculty, there's no courses anymore, there are no lectures anymore about the history of the field, because that would dispel that misunderstanding. The views which are assigned to Adam Smith are actually the views of somebody who came nearly a century before him, a man called Bernard Mandeville. Mandeville was, his name doesn't suggest it, but he was a Dutch person who lived most of his life in Britain. And the view that Mandeville developed was the following, is that it is not virtues, but it is vices which lead society. It is by being greedy, it is by ignoring institutions, it is by ignoring fellow men that we can actually make a society operate. the way it is actually the subtitle of his main book called The Fable of the Bees. The subtitle of that book is Private Vices, Public Benefits. The main thesis of Mandeville is that we made a terrible error. We think that ethical behavior is what drives a society, and that without it, a society cannot work. He's just saying the opposite, that what I told you last time and that I summarized today. It is actually vices that make a society operate. And he gives as examples the fact that in order to protect houses against thieves, burglars, we have to put bars on the windows, and these bars will be made by a blacksmith, and the blacksmith will make a very good living by doing so. And it is essentially the vices which actually are the actual drive of society. So his view is that there's been a terrible mistake made by everybody before him, not only the people who believe that that man is a zoon politikon and lives by essence in a larger group, but also by people who have an individualist approach, but who think that virtues are good and that vices are bad because vices prevent societies to operate as it should. You know the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It is very much the reverse of what says Mandeville, but it's in the same way. There's been a big misunderstanding about what makes society operates. It is not by people being virtuous. It is by people following their instinct, and in particular their vices. It is greed. It is greed that makes a society work. It is not restraint. And so on. That view is indeed consistent. It is consistent with the view of the Homo economicus. It is consistent with the principles of that new political economy. And what happened? What happened in the period? What happened in that period? It goes from I must say first that the views of Mandeville were not popular at all at the time that he expressed them. Everybody around was against him. Everybody was saying this is terrible. And one of his fiercest adversaries, and that's I would say the irony, was Adam Smith himself. Adam Smith wrote in his own books, "Virtue is the great support and vice the great disturber of human society. Virtue, which is, as it were, the fine polish to the wheels of society, while vice, like the vile rust which makes them jar and grate upon one another, is as necessarily offensive." And the fact is, if you go to the historical Adam Smith, he was very much a person who would promote the idea of trade unions. He was a person who would very much be branded nowadays as being a left-wing person. He was among the very few in England in his time to be enthusiastic about the French Revolution. He died in 1790. He didn't see what happened later. But he was very much, I would say, the opposite of the representation of his, that the Adam Smith Society in the United States has promoted. And it is that Adam Smith Society that's built a statue of him, a bust of him in the town in Scotland where he was born. And I think there's an inscription from Milton Friedman underneath, which would really have made the historical Adam Smith a cringe. Why that mistake? Why that misallocation of some views to Adam Smith that were actually defended by Mandeville? The reason is the following, is that he makes some reference in some point to the fact that self-interest can actually work despite that. that the common good may emerge despite the fact that people follow their self-interest. And he called that view, he used it at several occasions, not many, only 3 in his whole works. He used the image of the invisible hand for that. And that image of the invisible hand caught. That was something that people started understanding. And because he used that view, it is to him that by accident, and showing essentially that, you know, some good economists don't read the authors that they quote, that misunderstanding appeared. In the most important passage in which Adam Smith refers to that, he's not using actually the phrase invisible hand, but I will read it to you because it is a, oh no, I'm sorry, you use it in that passage further down. I'll read it to you because it is interesting, because a lot of what we will be talking about in that course of lectures will be related to one way or other thinking whether what is said in there is correct or is not. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. He, the butcher, generally indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security. And by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was not part of his intentions. Nor is he always the worse for the society that it was not part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. It is an affectation, indeed, not very common among merchants, and very few words need to be employed in dissuading them from it. Apparently, there is something common in what is being said there by Adam Smith and by Mandeville, who had written his book about 60 years before. The Fable of the Bees, published for the first time in 1714, and the Wealth of Nations, of which this is an extract, is published the first time in 1776, so 62 years later. When we look historically at what was Adam Smith writing about, he was very much part of the thinkers who were still thinking of the British Revolution, where absolute monarchy in the what has become the United Kingdom would be replaced by parliamentary democracy. This was still a reply to the people who said that only a king could actually decide what was good for a people. This was very much, I would say, a plea for democracy rather than anything else. This idea then of the invisible hand became predominant in the period, not so much at the time of Adam Smith himself, and definitely not at the time of Mandeville, where I said there was an outcry. Everybody, all philosophers in the world, united to say that he was wrong, that societies were operating when people were virtuous, and that they were not operating when people were vicious. The ideas became familiar, as I said, in that period when there's a new economics which replaces political economy, and this is in around 1870s, 1875. From that time on, that view that we don't have to bother really with ethics in the realm of economics and of finance became a dominant view until about 2007, 2008, when the crisis started, when the crisis starts, you hear again, and that a number of people have noticed it, suddenly you hear again the view that ethics are necessary to tame finance, that is important that financiers, that people in banking and all other financial activities become virtuous again. Something happens in that particular time which suggests that the view of the invisible hand is not necessarily operating. I'm just check here because I don't want to sacrifice the 15 minutes later. What happens in 2007, 2008? Why is this notion of financial ethics suddenly coming back to the fore again? Because there is a loss of confidence, of trust in the image of the invisible hand. And the most dramatic event in that respect can actually be seen on a video that you can actually watch. It is in the very early days of October 2008, I believe it's on the 8th of October, there is a session in the American Congress where Mr. Alan Greenspan is called and is asked to explain to the congressmen, to the parliamentary representatives, what has happened. At that point, Mr. Greenspan is not at the head of the Federal Reserve anymore. He's not the governor of the Central Bank of the United States. He's been for 19 years, from 1987 to 2006. In 2008, when he's asked to give an explanation, it's not because he's the head of the bank. This is by then already Mr. Bernanke, who is. But there is a feeling that he has a responsibility in the crisis, and that's what he is being asked about. A number of things have happened. For instance, he's been asked several times to introduce regulation of what is called derivative financial instruments. He has refused consistently to introduce any regulation of that. He's been warned by Mr. Gramlich. Mr. Gramlich would die very little time after that. Mr. Gramlich was a governor of one of the regional Federal Reserve banks. He's been warned by him about the developing crisis in the subprimes, and Mr. Greenspan has refused to do anything about it. Mr. Greenspan defines himself as being a libertarian. A libertarian is very much a person who believes in the homo economicus, who believes in that view that I've just described. He went in 2006, he went to give a lecture in the birthplace of Adam Smith to make a plea in favor of the invisible hand, assigning it to Adam Smith. And what happens why is he called on the 8th of October 2008 to testify? And if you watch that video, you'll see there's a lot of agitation, there's a lot of rancor. It's not, how would I say, it's not a quiet occasion. There's a lot of people speaking in the background, a lot of people not being very happy with what happened. What happened before, 3 weeks earlier, is that the investment bank, Lehman Brothers, has filed for bankruptcy on the 16th of September. And what happened at that point is what they called a systemic risk. The bankruptcy of that bank has produced a total collapse of a major part of the financial system, which is called the money markets. The money markets is the market where you can actually sell and buy short-term financial debt instruments. A debt instrument is a promissory note, a promise to pay back for some money which has been lent and usually associated, as you know, with the payment of interest. The money markets are for debt instruments from overnight, meaning from one day to the next, to 1 year, 1 month, 3 months, etc. And that whole market has collapsed in about 5-6 days after the collapse of the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. And within a day, about 1 trillion of money in dollars has been injected in the financial systems in order to save it from total collapse. It's about 600, something like 600 billions of dollars. But Europe has also contributed. Japan has also contributed to prevent the collapse of the system. And the total being about 1 trillion, 1,000 billion dollars that had been injected like over 24 hours in order to prevent the system from collapsing. The system didn't work anymore, and money was just injected until things were saved. What happened? I won't go into the details, but in a system where you trade debt on a short-term basis, you cannot have that the money being lent will not be repaid. If you lend $1, it should be $1 that will be paid back plus interest. And what happens on that day is that the value goes down. It goes to 98, I believe in one case, 98 cents to the dollar, and so there's a loss. And because that loss spreads into the system, which is entirely interconnected at the international level, more and money has to be put in order to maintain that $1 to $1. It would, if it had happened that you only paid 98 cents to the dollar, that's what is called in finance restructuration. There's a loss that's being taken into account. And so when Mr. Greenspan is asked to talk, or to explain what has happened, he's a person who always gave very complex explanation to everything. And one time he even said, if you've understood what I said, then probably I must have expressed me not in the way that I intended. He said that as a joke because he knew that his explanation was always extremely technical. He's a very brilliant financial person. He's very, very smart. At the time he was at the head of the Federal Reserve. He was surrounded by an extremely good team of researchers. He was definitely a person of very high caliber in terms of understanding finance. But he's a person who was a total believer in the invisible hand, that you didn't have to regulate, that if it was the total freedom of individuals pursuing their own interest that would make the system work. And so on that 8th of October, when he's asked to explain what had happened, he does so. And yes, you'll see facing him, I was a person who was my own representative in Los Angeles, Congressman Waxman, who very gave a hard time to Greenspan, kept asking him, but really what happened, up to the point when Greenspan says, he says a very convoluted sentence. He says, I believe that the persons who were the head of that mortgage industry would have followed their own self-interest. Nobody much understood what he meant, but we do, because I gave you the background of that. And the background was also that speech he gave in 2006 in Kilkenny in Scotland, and the birthplace of Adam Smith. When he says that, he said, I believe that the people who were the head of these companies, establishments that were allocating credit to people who wanted credit in order to a mortgage, in order to buy a house. I thought that these people would have followed their own self-interest. And what he sees as the reason of what the collapse of the self-regulation of the invisible hand is the fact that he believes that these people have not, at that point, followed their self-interest. If they had followed their self-interest, the invisible hand would have actually been acting according to him. So he can't explain why these people stopped following their self-interest. I was working at the time in one of these companies, and I know perfectly that my boss was following his own self-interest. But what was his self-interest at the time? It was not at all anymore to work in a way that would make, like the baker and the butcher of Adam Smith, make the system work altogether. My boss was selling all the shares he had in the company. He was doing it legally. There was no fraud involved. He was getting out of the system and trying to get out of the system altogether. Had he wanted to operate, I would say, in the interest of the common good, there were no institutions, to my knowledge, where he could have actually done that. There was no place to turn and say, this is what's happening to the mortgage industry, the subprime mortgage industry, and that would have led to not the system collapse. What Mr. Greenspan knew at the time also is that some people in other companies had very much followed their self-interest, but that self-interest had very much ceased to operate for the common good. And I'll give you an example, because that example is, I would say, probably the best illustration you can think of the fact that in most cases, when things work okay, there will be something like an invisible hand. The butcher will just want to sell the meat, and the baker will want to sell the bread, and that will make the whole system operate. But in some cases, when things turn sour, people will want to disengage themselves. And the example is the following. This we know because there was another hearing, and that was also at the, I believe, no, it was a senatorial an American senatorial meeting, and that was in 2010, when the heads of the company, the investment bank, one that has survived, Goldman Sachs, were asked to explain what they had been doing in the period in 2008, at that time that I was talking about, of the total collapse of the system. What had Goldman Sachs made? And what I'm saying there is not a supposition. I'm not having a kind of theory about that. We heard these people say that in the hearing. And because it was happening in the United States, I was there at 2 or 3 in the morning here, watching this and reporting about it on my blog. When the company, Goldman Sachs, realized that these securities, I have to explain what a security is. A security is the following. If you borrow money from the bank can just wait that you pay back, and that will be it. If you borrow for 10 years, 100,000 euros, well, the bank may have to wait 10 years in order to get all the money paid back. If there's an amortizing payment, then you pay back some of the money. If there's no amortizing, then you pay back the money you borrowed just at the end of the period, the 10 years. But in any case, the bank cannot just have the money back. It's been borrowed, it's been paid to you, and you're repaying little by little. But what the bank can do, and that's something that started being done essentially in the, let's say, the second half of the 20th century, what the bank can do is to resell that debt. Ask if somebody else is not interested in having the burden to claim the money back from you and receiving the interest. Of course, the bank will give a discount if somebody is prepared to buy that from him or her, from it. So that's what's happening, developing what we call the secondary market for debt instruments. There's a place where banks can actually resell to somebody else the claim on the money has paid to you. As far as banks are concerned, consumer credit, the money you borrow to buy a car or mortgage on a house, this, as far as the bank is concerned, is small money. It's not much. It started in the 1970s, 1980s, that banks would start to sell to each other and buy from each other these mortgages or an auto loan, as it's called, and so on. But it's a lot of trouble. It's a lot of money in terms of cost of processing the files to do so. So what they started to do was the following. They put a lot of those together in order to make like a big obligation, like a big bond, like a big instrument, like a big debt instrument, like a nation issues in order to get money. When
a nation issues a debt, it means the following: is borrowing from people, and they say, okay, I want to issue for 1 billion euros, and people say, okay, I can lend you some money, and some interest will be paid, and that's the way that debt is being issued. So what they start doing in consumer credit is to put typically 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 of these individual mortgages on individual houses, putting them together in order to make a big obligation of I don't know, $1 billion. And that would be customized in such a way that it would behave very much like a big bond that nations issue. In the very beginning of the crisis, what happens in the beginning of the crisis in 2007, it is the following, is that the people, and I won't go into details of that at all today, but the people who have borrowed money and who are regarded as subprime, who are people who are not very rich, they start being able to pay back, to pay the interest, to pay back the money they've borrowed, because the bubble, the real residential real estate bubble is bursting in the United States. I'm not going into that. I just want to explain what Goldman Sachs has been doing. They are selling and buying these securities, as they're called, to their clients. They first believe, like other banks, that everything will be fine, that things will work out, and at some point they realize that that won't be possible. But instead of taking a loss on that, the first reaction they have is to find some of their clients to which they can sell these products that they know are depreciating, that their worth is not anymore what it is supposed to be. That typically, where you're told that you will be given $1 back for $1 you've lent, that you will only get back 98 cents or 90 or 70 or whatever. They turn to their best clients, and they try to ditch, as they say, the product. They try to sell it, saying it's still very good. They hide the reality of the situation, and they start selling that to their best clients. And there are questions being asked in that senatorial hearing to Mr. Blankfein, who's still the head of CEO, head of the Goldman company. Is that Goldman Sachs company? Is that something you can do to your client? And he's saying, like Mr. Milton Friedman was saying it a few years before, I'm working for my investors. The rest is not of my business. When Mr. Skilling, who was the head of the Enron company that collapsed in 2001, was asked the question of what do you do when you have a bad product? He said the same. He said it's for the state to bother whether it's a good product or not. To me, my only concern is to sell it for the interest of my shareholders. So the first thing that Goldman Sachs does to try to make some money in the process of the collapse is first discarding the products, trying to sell them still at a very high price, hiding the information to their client that the product has actually been depreciating, that they will not get back the money, that actually be the full amount of the money that they're paying. But the second thing they do, and that's what I would say is the most destructive to Mr. Greenspan's view, is that in order to make money, they will start betting on the collapse of the system. And the image is a bit like the one, in that case, of that I use in the inaugural lecture about that, fire in a big department store in France in the 19th century, where people were actually fighting to get out, and there was no common good emerging at all from self-interest. What Goldman Sachs does is the following. They take some of these securities made out of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 individual mortgages and individual credits. They ask a hedge fund to make them as bad as possible, to look into what is the most likely, the most likely people will not repay. They try to make the product which is the worst possible, and then they organize bets. They ask their clients to bet on the fact that the money will not go, and they made, there's some kind of propaganda saying, well, this is still very good. but they, on their side, they bet on the fact that the value will go down, and they're not taking any risk because they have arranged that the product is as bad as possible. This example is totally destructive, of course, of the view invisible hand is working, operating all the time. Because in this particular case, you see organizing bets on the fact that the system collapsed. That will, and it did, it will only precipitate the downfall of the whole system. If you have people pushing for it going worse, if in the fire somebody is pouring some oil, some petrol in order for the fire to catch up even more, of course things will be worse. And this example that Mr. Greenspan knew is that the self-interest was not at all, in that case, conducive to the system getting any better or trying to, or even recovering. It was actually what was happening. It was making things very much worse. There was, of course, something suicidal there, that the state had to inject more money than would have otherwise been necessary, just because some of the insiders were pouring oil on the fire in order for them to make a profit by betting on the systems not working. Just a little anecdote before I turn to you and ask you, propose that you ask a question. At that time, there was in the technical literature in finance, there was an article that came up saying that if you wanted to cheat in that particular way, like making a security as bad as possible, there were ways of hiding it by using a particular computer algorithm, a particular computer technique, such that it would be impossible to find out about the cheating. Why? Because you would do it in such manner that the power, that the computer power necessary to find out about the fraud would be so high that there's no way anybody would actually be able to test that. There's one particular product, financial product, on which a majority of these bets were organized not only by Goldman Sachs but by other companies like Deutsche Bank, which makes me suspect that had been devised according to the method that was suggested in a particular article. Otherwise, I don't think there was any justification for a lot of the bets being aimed on that particular, on the fate of that one particular security. I will stop here and I'll turn to you and asking you if you want to ask any questions on last lecture and this one. I spent some time at the beginning of this lecture for recapitulating what I'd said in the first. I think it applies very much to this one because the first one and the second, to some extent, tie in and made a kind of a unit. Yes?
What about transparency as required by Adam Smith?
Transparency is an issue that I intend to talk over a full lecture, but I will not refuse to answer your question by saying that transparency, the notion of transparency, is very much linked to another principle which is underlying the new economics that developed in the 1870s. It is linked to a view that was developed by a physicist, astronomer of the time, Laplace. And Laplace has said the following. He had a very extreme view of determinism. He said, if we know exactly what's going on now, we can say anything we want about any moment in the future because there will be a necessary development from there. That view was very popular in the 1870s when the new science of economics developed. It has been challenged by physics. It ceased to be popular in physics since then. One in the 1920s, quantum mechanics developed, which shows that at the lower levels there are quantum fluctuations which are unpredictable, and that in some particular circumstances, which is called coherence in physics, these quantum variations, which are in a predictable nature, will emerge at our physical level, at the macro level, as we say, at the level at which we live. There are things that, I would say, little variations which usually neutralize each other because they're such at a lower level that they won't be an importance. They can actually coalesce in such a way that they will make a difference at our level. There's a classical mental experiment in physics called the cat of Schrödinger, showing that if you imagine a situation of that type, of having a cat in a box, and that there's the flask containing poison, and that quantum fluctuations will actually appear at the macro level where the bottle is, that will break it or not, because the quantum fluctuation can be go either way. It can even be superimposed on each other, that you have actually two states being there present at the same time. The cat could be at the same time alive and dead. But other things developed later on. It was Poincaré at the beginning of the 20th century who showed what was developed later on as chaos theory. Chaos theory simply, it's not about chaos as such. It shows you that deterministic processes can actually become totally undeterministic at some particular circumstances, that it becomes totally unpredictable. The view that a perfect knowledge of what is happening now can produce a perfect knowledge on the future is underlying all these views that you can always replace a situation where you would improve things by imposing new regulation. You can always replace that by better, more transparent knowledge of the current circumstances, is a view which is in the line of that principle from Laplace from the 19th century. What happened is that that new economics that develops in the end of the 19th century supposes a particular type of psychology of individuals. For instance, there's no unconscious. The Homo economicus, in his Rationality, you cannot introduce the idea of any unconscious process there. He's perfectly conscious of our decision he's taking. The view about the Laplacian physics suggests a particular view of physics. And what has happened in the history of economic theory is that it has never changed these underlying principles in terms of psychology or in terms of physics underlying the system. When I say never, recently you have something that developed in economics called behavioral economics, and that's challenging the view of the Homo economicus. Are we really making allocations on scarce resources, again, in terms of preferences ranked by utility? Some psychologists and within economics have started trying to question that and show, for instance, that when we gain or then we lose, whether we gain or lose in a process, in a financial process, we do not behave in the same manner. It's not symmetrical and so on. As I said, I'll come back to that notion of transparency. Regulators usually say that they're totally in favor of transparency because it makes our knowledge of the future perfect. But in recent times, about what we call dark pools, about what we call high-frequency trading, regulators have turned a blind eye on the fact that these go totally against transparency. They go against the notion that people would have, as they say, symmetrical access to information, and they meaning that even these principles are sometimes betrayed when there are other considerations coming into the picture. Anyone else? Yes?
You mentioned the real estate bubble that was at the base of the crisis in 2007.
Yes.
And you mentioned that was when self-interest was detrimental to the common good.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't you leaving out the fact that in years preceding the crisis, the bankers were forced by social legislation not to pursue their own self-interest? As in, they had to give out loans to people of whom they know they would never be able to pay back the
Yeah, I've heard that view expressed, but fortunately, I would say I was working in the business, and I know that was not the case. The view is based on the fact that it would have been, during the Clinton administration, that it would have been, that the banks would have been forced to give, allocate loans to people who were not able to repay them. The process would have been through what they call the, I forget, the government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, essentially. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac never did that, what they were told. They were mixed in terms of being both private and public organizations. They resisted fully the idea that they would do that. They were caught all the time not allocating loans to people belonging to minorities. Why is that? Because they were private companies, because they had to refer to their shareholders, and therefore they didn't go into business that were not profitable. They worked only on the upper end of the market. It was essentially to the upper middle classes and middle classes that allocated the money. So if you believe, let's say what was said, that there was a national, I would say, governmental policy that people with low resources would receive these loans. It was actually, it never happened. The government-sponsored entities managed to go around the process. They didn't do it. They made a lot of money for their investors by not applying that policy. I need to add one thing, which is there was a policy to try to improve access to property in the United States. And the underlying view is that is based on sociological studies that were done essentially in the 1950s and 60s, showing that ethnic problems occur less in neighborhoods where people are owners. There are calculations which I show in one of my books on the subject, showing that in neighborhoods where there are more owners than renters, kids succeed better at school, there are fewer incidents with the police, and so on. So there has been, and I think it's not only in the United States, there has been that view that access to property is something which is positive for a society as a whole. But the main promoter of that is not at all in the United States coming from what we would say left-wing circles. It is coming from the extreme right. It is the libertarians. The program, the Ownership Society of President Bush was written by the Cato Institute, which is not at all, I say, in favor of Democrats or President Clinton and then President Obama. These are libertarian, it's a libertarian think tank, which is much more closer to the view that were held by Mr. Greenspan. So the idea that there was as any connection, causal connection, between the wanting to have poor people access to property and the crisis as such is not substantiated. It didn't happen that way. Yes?
Since one of the major causes of the 2007-2008 financial crisis is the deregulation of financial markets, particularly the derivatives markets, do you still see benefits or is self-regulation still beneficial for financial markets, or what balance should there be between regulation and self-regulation?
My answer would be, I would say, funny, because I would say if we can trust people to becoming more and more virtuous, you don't need a regulation. But if there is something within the system which leads people to, as I gave the example with Goldman Sachs, that following your self-interest in most cases when things are going okay, it will work. But when things are not working okay, then the whole system will collapse. I think it's important to put, as we would say, a prudential environment in such a way that you don't have to rely so much on people's judgment of what to do next, but that you've put the boundaries around in such a way that the system will not work. The view I would defend, and I will come back to that, and I guess in many cases, is the following. In order to be able to ask people to be virtuous, the institutional framework should be such that people will not be at a disadvantage in the environment by being virtuous. If you say people stop doing this type of attitude, and if the one who does it knows that he will go bankrupt because all his competitors will not do it, you cannot simply encourage people from doing it. If you set up an institutional environment in which you're not disadvantaged by having the virtuous attitude, then of course it will work. And what is interesting is that the first person who really stated that things in this particular way is, to my knowledge, is Saint-Just, the French revolutionary. He was very close to Robespierre in the time of the terror, when people were asked to be virtuous, but there were no institutions allowing to do that. And then the framework you had to put together was the one called la terror. If you ask people to be virtuous and nothing else, you will have to just increase the police force and put more people in jail, and like happened in those days, to execute a larger number of persons. But in the very last days, where that process is going totally wrong, Saint-Just writes a discourse. The view there is best expressed in the last speech that he will never pronounce, actually, because he'll be interrupted because there's a majority developing against the views he's expressing. But he had expressed that before, and he said that very much, that thing. We've asked people to be virtuous, but we didn't put the framework, we didn't set the framework that would not allow people to be virtuous without them being at a terrible disadvantage if they do so. So I would say that's probably the approach we need to develop. And there are cases, I believe, where we should go back to simply prohibiting things which are dangerous, and where you cannot trust people's self-interest to just do the right thing in that particular context, because precisely when things may turn wrong within the total environment, then their self-interest will just make them precipitate the process. And if you use the terms like physicists do of feedback, a negative feedback is not a bad thing. If negative feedback is when things go automatically back to the state where they were. That's a negative feedback. The reaction is to remove the interference that came from outside. A positive feedback is like snowballing, or a chain reaction is when the process goes out of hand. And wherever, I believe, in finance, there's a potentiality for a snowballing process, we need to set the framework to prevent that from happening. That view about transparency is working in such a way that regulation will never be necessary if there's enough transparency. I think that's naive. It's been disconfirmed by physics. We have now too many examples where it's not the case. If something is really dangerous, if something is really introducing systemic risk, we have to put a dam around it to prevent it from happening, not just trust that it will work next time. What is the pity right now is that a number of these rules are being proposed in different cases, but that lobbying, and there are 3 recent cases, I wrote about it in my most recent piece in Le Monde, my most recent column, in 3 instances very recently. A framework like the one I'm suggesting should be there, has been actually lobbies have managed to prevent that the new rules would be instated. One example, very recent, is precisely about that the money markets that I mentioned earlier. rules have been written by the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, which is a regulator for the stock markets in the United States. And the lobbying has prevented these rules being taken, meaning that rules which were set very precisely after 5 years of work in order to prevent that a new crisis like the one that develops around the 22nd of September 2008, these rules are not being accepted, and the discussion is not going even on, because on the board of the SEC there's agreement and they will not be proposed. In that case, we're not removing the possibility that the same circumstances developed as they have in September 2008, although we know how it could be done. But the markets, the money markets, regard these measures as being too expensive, too dear to them, and that therefore they will not approve them. And another example recently is by the oil markets, who have refused that some rules are being instated. They said if these rules are instated, they will refuse to communicate the data around the markets, and therefore it will not be able to work at all. Before we finish, I want to tell you one thing, because I'm very proud, and I'll tell you something you don't know, which is the secret dream of any university professor, which is to publish comic books. And my first comic book is coming out today, and now I need to add, it's not a comic book, it's not like Batman or Superman, it's all the same issues we're discussing here. At some point, a drawer, somebody who can make books of that type, approached me and said, it would be interesting that the views you have and the ideas you express, like in lectures or in books, could have another medium, that we could transmit the same message through that medium. Now, it's not like a pure illustration of my lectures. It's supposed to be funny. It's supposed to be really like a comic book, but it's the same views that I'm trying to develop there. And I'm very happy that it's supported by Arte, you know, Arte, the television program. They decide to put their imprint on that. And the publisher is a subsidiary of Gallimard, so it's a very nice and decent publisher in France. Thank you.